So you're welcome on the show this afternoon, Corinna. So quickly, I'm going to let you introduce yourself, and then we'll jump straight at it with the questions. So can you?
Yeah, of course. So my name is Corinna Linz. I'm living actually in Germany, and I'm working as an IT consultant in the collaboration area. So I'm working now for already over 7 years. And yeah, so I grew up in Romania, not really in Germany, but I moved here a couple of years ago, about 13 years ago, and now I'm working here for many years as a consultant. Actually, I'm working at MSG Services in here in Germany. And yeah, initially I started with SharePoint. I was a collaboration consultant for SharePoint, almost on premises. But in the last years, I focused more on collaboration in Office 365 and all the tools around the SharePoint ecosystem in the Office 365 world. Yeah, so that's the short introduction.
So let's jump straight at it, Corinna. Can you tell us what is SharePoint Online and what can we do with SharePoint Online?
Yeah, so it's not so easy to have a short definition about what is SharePoint Online. So the first thing is SharePoint Online is the online version of SharePoint. This means it's a hosted service by Microsoft in the cloud. And SharePoint Online is a web application. This means you can access SharePoint Online in a browser. And SharePoint Online is almost a content management system. This means you can share their content. You can save your data. You can save your files. You can have lists, but you can also have your intranet, your company intranet, in SharePoint Online. And I'm seeing that a lot of customers, if they hear about SharePoint, they already get scared, because in the past SharePoint was not so powerful, and the older on-premises versions were not so good. So the customers don't like so much this word SharePoint. So it's much more better if they don't hear the word, but they use it. It's yeah, it's easy to say, but it's like that.
Okay. So I want to ask real quick as a follow-up question. People or the techie people like to refer to SharePoint as a monster application, that we can use to do just about anything. Is that truly correct? Or what's your take on this one?
Yeah, so my opinion is that you can do almost everything. There are also a lot of customers that are using SharePoint only as a file share, but it's not only a file share. You can do much more. You can store there your data, yes, your files, but you can tag them with metadata. You can search for content and find. And if you really invest a little bit energy in a SharePoint platform, you have it, yes, your own knowledge management, and you have a good search, very good Office 365 search in SharePoint Online. Also in SharePoint on premises, you have a good search. You have to configure it, and then you will find the content you need, because in a company you create a lot of data, a lot of documents, and if you search 2 or 3 years later, you also need to find that information and not being busy to search for it for a couple of hours.
Yeah. Okay. So how about those customers with on-premises version of SharePoint? They are not using SharePoint Online now. They have SharePoint already installed on-prem. Is there any benefit? Do they get any benefit for migrating to SharePoint Online? If they have to switch, is there a benefit to those kind of customers?
Yes, they have benefits, but of course you also have to take a look on the context. You have to take a look how big is the company. because SharePoint on premises, it's the licensing is that way. You're licensing the server. In SharePoint Online, you buy Office 365 or only SharePoint licenses for every user. This means that for bigger companies, for very huge companies, maybe sometimes it can get more expensive, but for smaller companies, it's much more better to go to SharePoint Online. And so, in fact, if you see it on long term, you will reduce the costs if you go to SharePoint Online. It's also a topic about security. So SharePoint, if you have a SharePoint on premises, you have local servers. This means you have to secure your data, your servers, and you can access from outside. If you're not in the company network, you can access the SharePoint. You need a VPN access or something to have a secure access. In SharePoint Online, you don't need this because in SharePoint Online, it's doing Microsoft everything for you. So Microsoft is securing your servers, and you can also have multi-factor authentication in SharePoint Online that offers you more security in accessing the data. And like today, like now, when we're working from home, it's much more easier to if you're in SharePoint Online, because you can access much more easier data from home. Another advantage is that you get in SharePoint Online, you get automatically all the new updates from Microsoft. So if something comes new, you get the update. In SharePoint on premises, there is an administrator, and the administrator patches the updates. That's the difference. And one more thing, sorry. But also very important is the integration with other Office 365 services, because if you already think about, okay, Microsoft Teams or something like else, the integration with all these services is really good in SharePoint Online. And in SharePoint On-Prem, you don't have it. No.
Okay, thank you for that response, Corinna. So I want to ask real quick, do you think there's any need for any organization now who wants to embrace SharePoint to think about having SharePoint installed on premises, or is it just better for them to go straight to SharePoint Online, regardless of how big they are? You know, what would be your advice? Would you advise that they still invest in SharePoint on premises, or would you advise them to just go with SharePoint Online?
So if they don't have any SharePoint, any data in SharePoint already, for example, in older versions, if they start now from scratch and the customer has to decide, okay, do I go with SharePoint 2019 or Office 365? I would recommend to go always with Office 365, so SharePoint Online. But there is a but, because there are some companies that have some security irregularities, like patent information or very data that is not allowed to be in the cloud because it's very sensitive data. So, and if you have this case, it's not the best option to go online because you will not fulfill the security requirements and the regulations. But there is also an option to go hybrid, so to have SharePoint on premises and SharePoint online. But you have to be aware that it's getting more expensive because you have both.
Okay. So now let's talk about one of the things that SharePoint can do. I know one of the strengths of SharePoint is building websites with it. You know, SharePoint can help with building websites. So can you walk us through this? What kind of websites can we really build with SharePoint? And, you know, for those who are interested in building website with SharePoint, would they need to have any web development knowledge to be able to build very good looking, you know, professional looking website in SharePoint?
Yeah, so first of all, there is also a difference between SharePoint on premises, the older version, and SharePoint Online. So I would like to focus now on SharePoint Online and SharePoint 2019, because in SharePoint Online and SharePoint on premises 2019, you have the modern SharePoint sites. And here the idea is very easy. There are two basic site templates. There are the team sites and the communication sites. And like the name says, team site is for a team, and communication site is a site that you can use it to communicate to people. So it's more the communication one to everyone. Yeah? And this templates, it's very easy. You can create, so you only have to go to the portal. You need to have the permission to do that. You can create a team site. And there is also a basic design of this team site that is recommended from Microsoft. It's a standard basic design, and it's the same for the communication side. And from here on, it's very easy for an end user to customize it. You don't need to have any special development skills. It's only if you have special requirements. It's like always, if you have special requirements, you need special development skills, of course. But if you have basic requirements and you say, I want to build my intranet on SharePoint, you can use communication sites. You need content. The content is very important. You need to have a structure to have an idea how you want to show this information in SharePoint sites, and then just do it. And with a couple of videos and tutorials, you can get a small power user.
Okay. All right. So how about this? If we get to create a website in SharePoint or SharePoint Online, does this site automatically become a public site? Does it automatically become a site that people can reach on the internet? Or is there something we need to do that we have to do to make this site public?
So you can reach it from the internet, a SharePoint site, if you have the permission. So this means if you have the credentials and if you're if someone grants you the access. So a good example is I have created a SharePoint site and I'm the owner of this site. Yeah? And if you want to access my site, Kazim, I need to grant you access, yes? And I can do this either if you are in my Office 365 as a user, if you're already there as a user, or if you're not there, I can invite you with your private email address. You will get an invitation, and then you can access the site with your credentials via the browser in the internet.
Okay. So to be sure, to be clear with this now, you're saying that every site we create in SharePoint Online can be accessed over the internet, is automatically made public. Is that correct?
It could be made public. It always depends. It always depends on the security settings in the company.
Okay.
Because SharePoint is a part of Office 365, but if you have some security regulations in the company, then it's not public, so it's not mandatory. And public means always that it's not via the internet. You access the site and it's like a website. It means that you go there and you have to insert your credentials and your password, and then you have access on this content.
Okay. So the same principle, does it apply to SharePoint on-prem as well? That's the on-premises version of SharePoint. Does this also apply, or there's something extra we have to do to make those sites public?
Yeah, there's something extra you have to do. It's the thing I talked a little bit at the beginning. Office in SharePoint Online, Microsoft is doing all the security stuff for you. But in SharePoint on-premise, you are managing this, yes, and you have to to be sure that only people that should have access can access the sites. So there are different possibilities. You can use a virtual private network for the users. This means that users need to have an additional software on their computer to that authenticates them to SharePoint on premises, or there are also other options. For example, if you're doing an extranet and you there are different possibilities, but it's not so easy like in SharePoint Online. That's the important.
Okay, so this would be one of the advantages of SharePoint Online over SharePoint on premises then.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Now, let's talk about file sharing in SharePoint for a little bit, or for the remainder of the show. So what are the different ways of storing and sharing files in SharePoint? In SharePoint Online, I want to say. So what are those ways we could share and store files in SharePoint? Can you walk us through that quickly?
Yeah. So first of all, let's talk about storing. You have two easy options to store your data in SharePoint Online. First of all, you need to have in a SharePoint site, you need to have a SharePoint website. In this SharePoint website, you need to have a document library. This document library, you can imagine, it's like a folder. And in this folder, document library, you can save your data. Yes. And you can do it in two ways. Either you can access this website in the browser, and then you go there to this document library where the documents are stored, and then you can upload there the documents. You can do it by drag and drop, dragging the documents from your local storage, or you can upload it by a button. This is the first option. There is another option that makes work easier. It's with your own file explorer. So you can also use the file explorer to save data in SharePoint Online. But it's very important to know that you need to have an additional client, an additional software. It's the OneDrive client. It's also from Office 365. It's free. It just needs to be installed on your PC, and then you can access these documents from the File Explorer like you're doing it on a file share, for example. So it's the way you were also working before, probably.
Okay.
Can you still hear me?
Okay, yes, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, now I can hear you.
Okay. So I was asking that, how about document libraries and lists in SharePoint? You mentioned already that one of the ways of storing files in SharePoint is by using a document library. So what is the difference then between a document library and a list?
So first of all, the name of these two things already says it. Document library. It's a library where documents are stored. And list is a list. It's when you first access a list, some people will say, okay, this is a document library, but it's not a document library. The list, it's you can imagine it's like a list of information. For example, a list of contacts. And there you have the name, the surname, the phone number, the email address. This is a list, and it's like probably some lists like you were doing them in Excel before. You can now do it in SharePoint Online in a list. And such a list item in SharePoint Online can also have an attachment. So you can attach a document. And this is a little bit confusing sometimes because it's a list, you can attach a document. So why it is not a document library? A list is not a document library, but you can attach documents. That's a little bit weird. And the usability of using these documents in the list is not really good. So my recommendation is use lists, but don't use lists with attachment by default, because it doesn't make sense. Only if you really need an attachment.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And these files that we store in SharePoint, where are they really stored? Because I know what comes with O365 is also OneDrive for Business. And we use OneDrive for Business to also store our files. So when we save files in SharePoint, are they really stored inside of SharePoint, or you have another component of O365 that is helping to hold that data?
So the data for the end user is really stored in SharePoint. In the back end, if you really take a look in the back end, this data is in an SQL database.
Okay.
But for the end user, it's in SharePoint. So you will see. So you talked about OneDrive. OneDrive
Yes.
is also an area where you can store documents, but for your own. And documents that are in OneDrive, in fact, are also in SharePoint stored. Yeah.
Okay. And is it possible to share files in SharePoint with external users? I know you mentioned, you referenced it earlier, but just to be sure and to get this clarity right, is it possible? We have a file now stored on our SharePoint portal. Can I share that file with external users?
I'm in the class, please don't stop me.
Did you hear my question, Corinna?
I hear the beginning of the question. Yes.
Okay. Yes, I was asking if it's possible to share files we have in SharePoint with external users. Is that possible? Is that something we can do?
Yes.
Share online?
Yes. So we can store. We. Oh, sorry. So you can share documents with external users. Yes. Either you can share it with guests that are in an Office 365 tenant, or you can share it with a private email address of someone, of an external partner, for example. So yes, you can share it.
Okay. It's good to know that we can share files. Let me try to ask you this now. Which are your two best SharePoint features, and why do you like these features?
Again, yes, it's not so easy to say which are the two best, because there are a lot of good SharePoint features, but I think the best ones, if we talk about SharePoint Online, is the design and layout options for pages. So you really have, in comparison to the older SharePoint version, you have a lot of possibilities. You can define different layouts. For example, you want a page with 2 columns or 3 columns, and a red background and the green text, and fancy images and videos. And it's really easy to do that for a power user. Yeah, so this is the first thing, I think. And the second one is metadata. Probably a lot of people don't understand what is metadata. So in a short description it's like these are properties of the document. So you have documents have a name, documents have a changed date, modified date, they have modified the person that modified, and you can also have several metadata information. You can define categories for documents and a lot of metadata. And if you structure your content in SharePoint with metadata, it's very powerful, because you can find it's much more easier to navigate through documents that have good metadata. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Corinna, for sharing. So finally, what would you recommend to people listening right now who are interested in building a career in SharePoint? So what would be your advice to them? And are there resources, SharePoint resources you would like to recommend?
Yeah, so there are really many resources you can find in SharePoint for SharePoint. This is also because SharePoint is we have SharePoint for about 20 years, so that it has a big history. But to make it short, I'm using a lot Twitter. So I'm searching for SharePoint hashtags in Twitter, and there are a lot of people that are posting about SharePoint. They are posting about their own blogs and about interesting resources from Microsoft about SharePoint. And for me, it's the starting point to get all my news, my information and tips about SharePoint. And yeah, that's the first one. And the second one, I think there is the SharePoint lookbook. So you can search for in Google for SharePoint lookbook. There is a website, and this website shows you examples of modern SharePoint sites. Examples how a SharePoint site could look like, what elements these SharePoint sites contain, and these are templates, and you can also use these templates. If you have an Office 365 tenant, you can use these templates in your own Office 365 tenant. And one more I have, it's the Office 365 developer program. So the Office 365 developer program offers you free tenants for testing purposes for a certain time. So you can create a tenant and doing some tests and play a little bit around. You're having SharePoint, you're having the whole Office 365 environment, and it's a test environment, it's free, and you can have about 20 test users, and it's a very good way to play a little bit around.
Thank you so much for sharing that insight. I was going to put you on the spot, Corinna, for you to show us something live, but because of time, we're not going to be able to do that. So we'll just see if we can take one or two questions from those listening to us right now. So for those listening, if there's any question from anyone that Corinna can quickly respond to before we call it a close today. Any question?
Hello, Mrs. Corinna. Hello.
Hello.
Hello, good morning. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So the question is it possible for me to integrate Power Apps and SharePoint to create a business mobile app?
Yeah. So first of all, you can it's very easy. If you have a SharePoint, for example, you can start with the SharePoint list. You create a SharePoint list and from the user interface in SharePoint, you can create directly a Power App. This is the first way. You can do it also another way. You can create a Power App and connect Power App to SharePoint data. So the data you insert in a Power App, you can save in SharePoint. And of course, you can also connect it in the other way to show data from SharePoint in a Power App. For example, a list. You have a list with information, with data in SharePoint, and then you can integrate this in Power App. For example, to have a drop-down field in the Power App, and then you can fill this this information in the Power App with data from SharePoint.
All right, thank you. Is there any other question from anybody else? Okay, I'm afraid our time is well spent. Thank you so much, Corinna Lins, for coming on the show with me today. It is very nice having you on the show.
Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, okay. So listeners, let's do this again next week, Wednesday. So we started the series on Microsoft 365, and already we've looked at some part of Teams, So now we're talking SharePoint, and hopefully next week we're going to be looking at something else under the Microsoft 365 family. So it's good to have everyone join the show this afternoon. So we'll do it again next week so we can keep the conversation going on social media. It's Tech Talk Wednesday with Kazim across the social media platform. So thank you everyone for listening in and for joining in. Until next week, bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.